Okay, Senator McCarthy, how much credibility do you think Reagan has now with the Congress as far as his dealing, so to speak?
Okay.
Understand really why he ever had much credibility, because there was kind of an acceptance that he didn't quite know what he was doing or didn't remember, and he wasn't to be held accountable. And I think some of that protection is still with him. But the question of the Contras and even the Nicaragua aid was a more serious matter than the other things on which he seemed to be confused. And I think he's lost some strength because of those, I don't quite, they're not really revelations, that's too strong a word. More so than what he did on other things when he didn't have the right names or the right place or the right time. But I don't think it's hurt him in terms of his political power. He's probably hurt more by virtue of the two-term limitation on the presidency, which makes a lame duck out of almost every president, I think, especially in the last year, if he's in some trouble. It was a bad amendment, the two-term limitation. It just almost inevitably, I think it's likely to give you a president who's very careful in his first 4 years and then expects to be very bold and strong in the second 4 years, but finds that he can be bold and strong, but nobody cares.
Yeah. So you would change that if you ever?
Oh, I think it was a bad amendment. Yeah, I think the old system of an unlimited number of 4-year terms was probably as good as could be devised. The alternative might be to, if you elect a president, make him run until he loses. Yeah. Just to kind of the primitive practice. If you were elected king, you had to run, or chief, you had to run until you died or got killed. And say once you picked a guy, he's there for every 4 years until he gets beat or until something happens to him. But that would be better. The two-term thing is the worst possible arrangement, I think.
I've always thought that too, because it always seems like they just start getting what they really want done, and then it's over with, and they have to get out.
Yeah, and I think the president has to be pretty bad, I think, to be voted out his second term. When people say, well, he's only one term, give him another. Whereas if there's a chance he could run 2 or 3 more times, I think he'd be judged more harshly after the first term. And it's a formula, I think, for bad government. And it was sort of conceived badly. You have to kind of watch amendments in legislation, which is done sort of after the act and posthumously almost. That they were really getting even with Franklin Roosevelt when they passed the two-term limitation in the Eisenhower administration. They couldn't get him when he was in, so they said, well, let's say what would have happened if we could only have had this. And the same thing's true of the War Powers Act. It was sort of passed by Congress to defend themselves for not having done anything in 1968 and 70. So if we'd only had this War Powers Act, which we're now passing, we would have stopped that war, maybe.
What do you think about the United States supporting third world countries or getting involved with third world countries like as the Contras and such?
Yeah, I think it has to be very limited. There are 2 things that are not compatible with a democratic government. But one of them is to exercise colonial authority, because there's a basic contradiction between free democratic society and the status of colonies. We say we have all these rights for the mainliners, but not for the colonies. And you see it principally in things like Puerto Rico, for example, or Cuba, which was more directly a colony, or the Philippines. And the second is, I think you have to be very careful about any kind of so-called secret government or secret government activities of the kind that the CIA has been practicing since the end of World War II, at least since 1954, that this doesn't lend itself to open government and to congressional government, and so almost inevitably you get into conflicts such as we have now. And I don't see how they can be avoided unless you greatly restrict the involvement. For example, involvement in Angola. I don't think we knew enough about Angola, and not knowing enough, not being certain about it, we were prepared to proceed to use methods in Angola which we wouldn't use at home. And that same thing was true of Vietnam. Secret government, massacres, the whole thing just immediately corrupts the whole of society. And de Gaulle said a rather good thing when just before or after he became President of France. He was talking about the Algerian War, and he said in his campaign, Algeria is France, But shortly after he was elected, he said Algeria is not France anymore. And a country, he said, you can't remain a first-class country, a sovereign country, if your whole character is changed by virtue of a colony that you hold or a foreign policy commitment. And he said Algeria is destroying France, and therefore we say goodbye Algeria. And Vietnam, in a way, was really feeding back in a very destructive way into American government, American culture. Almost every aspect of American common life was affected. And it was so contrary to what we thought we were, so contrary to what we had done in previous wars. The whole code of honor, for example, was being violated every day. It corrupted the military. Our military, were out of World War II, when international law and the treatment of prisoners of war and treatment of civilians still had some meaning. We denounced the Nazis for massacres. Yet here we were, in a way, either forced or at least we thought justified in doing things that were essentially not very different from what they had done in a limited way.
What do you think is America's new outlook on the Soviet Union? Do you think it's improved, or do you think that it's changed at all? I mean, do you think it's improved toward the Soviet Union?
I think most Americans, don't have a very fixed view. They're quite willing to respond and to be more trustful, as they're being asked to do now. Mm-hmm. It's really almost a matter of propaganda. If certain things happen, or said, Afghanistan, we got to be against the Soviets now. Jimmy Carter said we won't go to the Olympics. Mm-hmm. Although the Russians came to the Olympics all the time, we were in Vietnam. So people said, well, okay, Afghanistan, if they get out of Afghanistan, then we'll get along with them. It swings back and forth. But I think underneath, unless there's a gross kind of international misconduct on the part of the Russians, that the general attitude now is one of acceptance.
That we're beginning to change, we're beginning to look toward them in a better light.
Well, you can only be frightened so long.
Yeah.
In the 40s, 45, after the war, they sort of said the Russians are coming by bomber. And we built a great early warning system all across Canada and Alaska, Sage, Dew Line, in the 50s. And people were encouraged to build fallout shelters. And they did. A lot of them built fallout shelters. And of course, the Russians never came. They never were coming. The warning system was obsolete when it was finished. And after about 5 years, people began to fall into their fallout shelters. They were plastic, and they only lasted about 5 years. And then the Russians were coming by submarine for a while, and then they were coming by international missiles. And people say, look, you can only tell us that so many times. And the only real military advantage the Russians have over us is in cavalry horses. It's estimated they got about 3,000 or 4,000 horses, and we've only got 29. So you say, well, they're coming on horseback, and we'd not have cavalry if you were going to fight them with cavalry. Henry Jackson was always the most worried person. I said one day, look, I don't want to tell you this, Henry, we really don't have enough cavalry horses. And we ought to build up, and one reason I sort of knew it was I had a friend who had written a movie script for a movie on Napoleon, and they need a lot of cavalry for Napoleon's reenactments. And the only place they could get enough horses and riders was to hire the Russian cavalry. So it was a way they earned hard dollars. You say, we got to have our own cavalry for no other reason than to use them in the movie, so we don't have to hire these Russian horsemen, you know. And that is sort of the range in which a lot of the apprehension about the Russians, I think, has finally fallen.
All right, Senator McCarthy, our generation will be living at least part of our lives in the 21st century, and I'm talking about today's generation. What do you see as our future, and do you think it's possible for us to help shape it in any way?
Well, I think it's important that you be concerned about it, because you know, what's likely to happen in 10 years is not going to start to happen after 9 years. It's in progress now, and I don't think it's Reagan's age or the age of people around him, because he's really no older than he was. I mean, 20 years ago he was as old as he is now, I think, in terms of his ideas. And the people around him, well, someone said, not of him, but it was applied to him, I don't know who said it, but he was talking about someone else back in history. He said he's curious, he imagines the past, but he remembers the future. And that's just kind of what Ronald is. He sort of doesn't distinguish between past and future very well, so it's always now. And he sort of lives for now. Nuclear defense has no future. It's always now. And the people who are likely to, or nuclear war, to suffer from it are those who will suffer not next year or the year after, but after the year 2000, probably, which are the people who are going to live into that century. And even the cost of payment. If you postpone payment for what is really a now defense or military position, you're going to have to pay for it 20 years from now. So that instead of paying these costs now, they're postponing it to after the year 2000, in effect. So the people who are 19 or 20 are now going to have to pay it. A whole series of internal disorders. Do you continue to let the poverty rolls grow, so you get 20 million, 30 million unemployment? We could handle 14 million unemployed up to a point in poverty, but then something happens, and it's likely to happen 10 years from now, and it's the younger people who are going to have to answer for it, or the pollution of the environment, acid rain and the general pollution, or just using up resources. 10 or 20 years from now, the crisis will come. And you ought to anticipate it, say, let's not be as wasteful, let's not pollute as much as we do, let's not be as destructive of the universe now, so that in 10 years we won't have to face crisis, and maybe not in 20 years, and maybe never.
Thank you very much, Senator McCarthy.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of Telstar News. Thank you for joining us.